Welcome, everybody. My name is Jessica Chu, and I am a member of the ICCT Communications team. Thank you for joining us today. Our webinar will be commenting on EPA's proposed rule for heavy-duty engine and vehicle standards. And today's presentation will last approximately 20 minutes. And afterward, we will have an additional 15 to 20 minutes for a Q&A and discussion. A couple of housekeeping items to begin with. This webinar is now being recorded. Everyone's microphone is currently on mute. However, it's very exciting. We have more than 200 people registered, so we are looking forward to sharing the information with you. If you have questions about the presentation, please write them in the question block in the control panel, and that's on your right side of the screen. And we will be collecting these throughout the presentation and answer them during the Q&A session. So today's webinar with ICCT's comment on EPA's proposed rule for heavy-duty engine and vehicle standards will be presented by our researchers Sarah Kelly and Claire Bicey. And before we begin, I'll let Raymond Harris, ICCT's Director of Heavy-Duty Vehicle Program, introduce the presenter and give a brief overview of the topic. So Ray, the floor is all yours.
Wonderful, thank you, Jessica, and thanks to the whole ICC team for helping us put this together. So as Jessica mentioned, I'm Raymond Harris, Director of our Heavy Duty Vehicles Program here at the ICCT, and I'm joined by my colleagues Sarah Kelly and Claire Bicey, who have really led huge parts of our analysis of EPA's proposed rule. So why don't we just get right into it, and Sarah, if you don't mind advancing us to the first slide. So first, for some context, we currently in the United States operate under a regulatory framework that is commonly referred to as the US 2010 engine standards. US EPA also has a set of greenhouse gas emission standards for heavy-duty vehicles. And the existing engine standards at the US were first adopted in 2001 and implemented in 2007 in their first year and were phased in through 2010. So we currently, at least on the NOx engine side, have a limit of about 200 milligrams per brake horsepower hour. And EPA has, for the first time since that original proposal, put forward a process now to revise those engine standards. So we've really seen about 2 decades pass since we first revisited these standards. President Biden came forward in August of 2021 with an executive order asking the EPA to go ahead and propose new engine standards for NOx in model year, beginning in model year 2027. And in the same rulemaking, consider revising greenhouse gas standards that are already adopted and in existence because of the potential role that zero-emission vehicles might play in the achievement of the Biden administration's climate objectives. And that is focusing on just the years 2027 and 2029. And the president also asked EPA to consider a separate process to promulgate a new phase 3 of its greenhouse gas vehicle standard that would begin as soon as model year 2030. So since that executive order, California has adopted its own engine standards for NOx, commonly referred to as the heavy-duty omnibus regulation, that achieves a 90% reduction in those engine standards that were previously in existence. And EPA this year, and just in the last few months, has finally released its proposed rule, and that's what we're going to focus on here today. The EPA has set May 16th as its deadline for public comment. So we're taking this opportunity with you all to share what our I'm still calling them draft comments are before we finalize those and actually submit them to EPA next Monday. Next slide, please. We're focusing on heavy-duty vehicles for multiple reasons, and here we just want to highlight one key motivation. COVID-19 really was difficult for most of us and continues to be difficult for many of us. But one set of analyses led by researchers at George Washington University has revealed the extent to which the very steep decline in traffic and vehicle activity, particularly in the United States, and particularly amongst light-duty vehicles, has created, in a sense, a natural experiment to illustrate and help us quantify the extent to which heavy-duty vehicles are disproportionately contributing to exposure disparities in disadvantaged communities. And so they came to the conclusion that targeting NOx emissions from heavy-duty vehicles is one of our most effective strategies for reducing disparities in emissions exposure nationwide. Next slide, please. So to summarize what EPA has proposed, it's really a two-part rule. So it's proposing new NOx engine standards, and on the NOx engine side, EPA is proposing two options, and they're taking comments on these two options. A first option would deliver a 90% reduction in the NOx emission limits by 2031 and would extend the useful life and warranty periods of new engines. A second option would deliver a 75% reduction in NOx with less stringent useful life and warranty. So EPA is taking comment on these two options and will decide which one to go with, and perhaps even go further. Both of these options contain additional provisions that we'll draw attention to today. One is a ZEB crediting mechanism that would allow manufacturers who produce zero-emission vehicles to sell engines that emit more NOx, and other changes to SCR inducement provisions that could lead to higher in-use emissions. On the GHG side, and this is where we're talking here about revisions to the phase 2 of the existing greenhouse gas regulation, EPA is proposing to tighten existing standards in model year 2027 by 1.5%, and they're focusing in on particular segments, those that include school and transit buses, delivery vans, and short-haul tractors, because they are right now moving the fastest in the market, more favorable to electrification because they can rely on depot charging. EPA is currently in their proposal maintaining ZEV super crediting, also known as advanced technology credits, until 2028. But they're taking comment on that, and also on whether they should actually set a zero-emission vehicle requirement. Next slide, please. So here's a first take, a first summary of what we're recommending. First, on the NOx engine side, that EPA dismissed the option 2. In our view, it does not reflect the best available technology. We also have the view that EPA could strengthen its option 1 by setting a 90% reduction in the NOx limits by 2027 as opposed to 2031, by also strengthening their SCR inducement provisions that they're proposing, including lowering their speed D rates and other disincentive overrides, and also not allowing ZEV crediting. I want to just put a really strong emphasis on that point, because I think there is this impression, and I think we just want to help folks understand that ZEV crediting will lead to more ZEVs. And we will highlight in our presentation today the extent to which ZEVs are already coming, largely due to state regulations, but EPA can go even further than that. And we want to be very careful that EPA not trade climate and health, which is a violation of a core principle of the ICCT captured in its Bellagio memorandum. So we feel strongly about making sure that there is a clear firewall between NOx control and ICE control and GHG control. So to get to the GHG side of the proposal of our recommendations, We are recommending that EPA set minimum production requirements for zero-emission vehicles to achieve 20, 30, and 40% ZEV sales in the years 2027, 2028, and 2029, I should say the model years. That they should also preserve the original phase 2 stringency for ICE vehicles because we see the potential for backsliding there, particularly because of ZEB crediting. And that gets to my third point, which is that we recommend they phase out ZEV super crediting towards the GHG side of their proposal in 2024 or as soon as feasible. So I'll stop there with my summary and I'll hand it over to Sarah, who's going to go in a little bit more depth on the NOx side. So Sarah, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, hi everyone. As Ray mentioned, I'm Sarah. I'm going to be talking specifically about our analysis and our recommendations on the NOx side of this proposal. So the first things we really want to point out first is that updating these NOx standards to this 90% reduction is technically feasible. There are various technology pathways for after treatment technologies that can achieve this 20 milligrams per horsepower hour NOx emissions in diesel engines. We have a couple that we are showing here that have been demonstrated after treatment technologies. The first was demonstrated by SWRI, and this one's really important because it's also been demonstrated to have the durability requirements that we are recommending the EPA include, and to be compliant with that standard at reasonable, a really tight margin. There's also an ongoing project for testing after treatment technology in use in Europe. And finally, not on the slide, but just wanted to mention there's also proven technology through Acades Power that can also meet these standards. Along with being technically feasible, we want to point out that updating these NOx standards is also economically feasible. So what I'm showing here is a graph that was made by ICCT, and it's a compilation of different studies measuring the marginal cost of these after treatment technologies that are needed to meet these 20 milligram per horsepower hour emission standards. And we've also included an ICCT measurement of the cost benefit break-even point, which is what we're saying is about a marginal cost of about $53,000. What you can notice if you look at this graph is that 4 of these 5 studies show that even in the highest cost estimates that they're making, they're still under that break-even point. There's one study that we're seeing that has some estimates that are above that in their highest cost estimate, and that's this study from EMA. And we just want to point out that this EMA study was conducted using entirely anonymous surveys of EMA members. And they did not publish their methodology. So we just want to say that although these are higher, we have some questions about the methodology used in that study, and the fact that all of these other studies are showing much lower costs gives us some good insight into the fact that these are technically or economically very feasible technologies. So now that we know that these NOx standards are both economically and technically feasible, we want to look a little bit more closely at some of the other things in the bill, and specifically one that Ray has already mentioned, which is this ZEB crediting provision. So we're going to talk a little bit about ZEB crediting specifically in the context of option 1. And let me just walk you through this slide a little bit. What we're thinking when we talk about when we say ZEB crediting is we're basically allowing manufacturers who take a set of their diesel engines and they're going to certify those diesel engines at a family emission limit, or FEL. And if they don't have credits, then that has to be under the emission limit. And so what this proposal allows is for manufacturers to gain credits from the sale of ZEVs and then use those credits to certify their engine families above that FEL. The proposal also includes an FEL cap, so saying even if you have a lot of credits, you can you can't certify your family of engines above this FEL cap. So what we've done here is we've looked at several different scenarios for potential ZEV deployment, and that's what we've laid out on the right of this graph. And we've said, all right, if there's this many ZEVs in the world or in the country, how many of these engines can be certified at that FEL cap rather than at the emission limit? So if we look at this light blue, this MOU states adopt ACT, that's just the states that have already committed to deploying a certain amount of ZEVs. And so if we say they all adopt the bills that they, or the regulations that would deploy ZEVs, with just that number of ZEVs, we're already seeing 11% of diesel engines that are going to be able to be certified at the emissions, that the FEL cap rather than at the emissions limit, just through ZEV credits. If we see higher ZEV deployment, which is what ICCT thinks the US will need in order to meet its climate goals, we're actually really seeing a much larger percentage of these diesel engines that are going to be certified at that FEL cap. And so what you're doing is you're basically creating a de facto emissions limit, which is the FEL cap, rather than the emissions limit itself. And as you get to higher ZEVs, you're really essentially eroding the stringency on diesel engines. So we just want to warn that this is a problem, and it creates this trade-off between ZEVs and diesel engines that we don't want to see. And we can look specifically a little bit more closely at how these different options will actually lead to changes in NOx emissions on a grander scale. So what we're showing here is from 2027 to 2050 under that MOU scenario, so under that scenario of states that have already made ZEV commitments but no additional ZEVs. As we go from the EPA 2010 standards to the EPA option 2 and option 1, we're seeing a drop off in the NOx emissions from 2027 to 2050. Now, both of these options see a drop off, but what we see is if we choose option 1 over option 2, we avoid nearly 1 million tons of NOx being emitted in that time frame. So just choosing option 2, you're already losing a large portion of the emissions reductions that you can see. But we also want to look at ways that we can strengthen EPA option 1. And a large part of that is considering ways to eliminate that ZEV crediting or limit that ZEV crediting and how it will affect the emissions of diesel engines. So there's a couple ways we thought about doing that. First is with lowering the FEL cap that I mentioned. Specifically in the year 2027 to 2030, that emissions FEL cap is very, very high. And one way to limit the amount that ZEVs can affect this is by lowering that, and specifically lowering that to always be 30 milligrams per horsepower hour above the emissions limit. And that will allow us to get some of the gains of eliminating ZEV credits altogether, which is another option and one that will get even more, reduce NOx emissions even more. And finally, if we adopt more of the rules that are being used in omnibus states, we'll get an even larger reduction. Now, one thing I really want to point out is that I'm showing this for this already, for a ZEV deployment level that's a moderate ZEV deployment level if states go through with their commitments but no additional ZEVs are put out. As we see more, if we see more ZEVs than what I'm showing here, which is again what ICCT really thinks is necessary, these differences are going to be a lot larger. So the benefits of going from EPA option 1 to reducing ZEV crediting and reducing that limit earlier are going to increase with larger ZEV deployment. So with all of that, I just want to go through each of these recommendations that we have so that you can all see them. The first is that as we kind of showed on that first slide, the amount of emissions from the current standards is really high. So we really encourage the EPA to finalize these NOx engine standards as soon as possible. The second is that we recommend EPA adopt an option 1 and strengthen it to align with 90% of that NOx reduction by model year 2027 rather than 2031. We recommend EPA eliminate ZEV crediting so that we're not seeing this trade-off between ZEVs and diesel engines. And finally, we recommend that the EPA strengthen these SCR inducement provisions so that we don't see too high of in-use emission NOx emissions compared to the standards. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Claire so that she can talk a little bit more about the GHG side of the bill, or of the proposal.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, we'll transition to the greenhouse gas side just briefly here before opening it up for questions. And so on this side, Sarah, could you go to the next slide, please? We modeled, just like NOx, we modeled the cumulative CO2 emissions impacts of the EPA's current phase 2 standards and the recommended updates that were proposed in the NPRM. And I'm showing this under a ZEV pathway that is what we would consider our baseline, driven by state level adoption of the ACT. And you can see in this slide under the proposed updates, there are like less than 1% reductions in cumulative CO2 emissions from class 4 through 8 vehicles, just from that proposal. So not a very large impact. Next slide, please. Then if ZEV deployment increases in this MOU scenario that Sarah has mentioned, the benefits of just increasing that ZEV uptake are about 0.3 gigatons of CO2, but additionally strengthening the requirements for ICE vehicles, so preserving the stringency of the rule for ICE vehicles more than doubles that benefit of just increasing ZEV deployment. So 0.5 gigatons additionally saved there. Next slide, please. And then I'm showing 3 additional scenarios that have increasing ZEV deployment and showing this with the context of our climate targets. So reducing, limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And previous ICCT analysis has identified that we need 4 gigaton CO2 reduction in order to be compatible in the heavy duty sector with limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And you can see that our more ambitious ZEV uptake scenarios, which align with advanced clean trucks or the draft advanced clean fleets targets at a federal level, achieve that 4 gigaton reduction, but lagging alignment with the advanced clean trucks rule would not meet that, and it actually reduces CO2 benefits by 1.2 gigatons, and it's not compatible. I also want to mention that more would be needed to align with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so what ICCT endorses here in terms of ZEV targets is something a little bit more ambitious than alignment with the advanced clean trucks regulation. And this is what Ray mentioned earlier, which is that 20, 30, and 40% overall heavy duty sales targets in 2027 through 2029. Next slide, please. And then pivoting a little bit, I want to drill down on some of the requirements for ICE vehicles. And so this table is showing efficiency improvements required just for ICE vehicles under different ZEV pathways and greenhouse gas standards. You can see under this first row, the no ZEV deployment. This is what the original phase 2 standards were expected to achieve because there was very little ZEV deployment expected. So this 14% efficiency improvement from model year 2017 baseline for rigid trucks and buses, and 22% for tractor trucks. As you increase the ZEV deployment, just with baseline state level action that has been currently adopted, you largely erase a lot of these benefits. And these are standards for model year 2027 for reference. And even further, if ZEV uptake increases even further, it allows manufacturers to actually backslide on emissions. And that would mean that the efficiency of these vehicles could be lower than what was required by previous standards, for example, the 2017 baseline, but also in model year 2021 and 2024. And so that's what that those negative numbers, -1% and -19% for tractors, are showing the opportunity for backsliding. Instead, if the greenhouse gas standard is aligned with what ICCT recommends, which is separating the ZEV production requirements from ICE stringency, you can maintain a lot of that. You essentially maintain stringency for ICE vehicles, and so it doesn't matter which ZEV pathway is achieved. ICE vehicles still meet those original phase 2 requirements. One other note here is the impact of ZEV supercrediting. And what I'm showing in the MOU state scenario is that simply removing those ZEV supercredits gets you a lot of the way towards removing the potential for backsliding. It doesn't completely align with the original stringency of phase 2, but it removes a lot of the risk in that situation. Next slide, please. And then here, just to summarize again, our recommendations for greenhouse gas standards. Like NOx, we encourage EPA to finalize the standards this year. We specifically recommend that EPA set minimum production requirements for zero emission vehicles of 20, 30, and 40% in 2027 through 2029. We recommend EPA preserve the original phase 2 stringency for ICE vehicles. And one step to take towards preserving that stringency is to phase out ZEV supercrediting, or these advanced technology credits, towards the greenhouse gas standard in 2024 or as soon as feasible. So with that summary, I will pass it back to Ray.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire, and thanks, Sarah, for your explanations there. And I think we have about less than 20 minutes for questions. So if any of you have questions you'd like to ask, there is a questions box. You can submit your comments to us there and I'll take those. So I think I'm going to start with you, Claire, since we were just talking about GHGs. So we have a question that's asking us, with respect to these targets of 20, 30, and 40%, are we being specific about targets for truck classes? Are we just giving average fleet-wide targets there? So
yeah, I think the 20, 30, and 40% are average targets. We are specifically recommending that these more market and tech-ready segments move faster, and we give some specificity about which segments we think should, and our modeling does elaborate on that, but our specific top-line recommendation isn't specific to segment.
Great, and I think I can add to that a little bit by saying our comments will include some reflection of what pace we think different market segments can move at. So I'd say there's a flexibility in setting fleet-wide targets without being specific to the segments, and that would allow manufacturers, for example, to decide we're going to electrify all of our buses fastest and first. But obviously, there's only so many buses that are sold, and so that would then require manufacturers to also make parallel investments in other segments that could move almost as fast, like refuse trucks and school buses and other types of depot charging-based vehicles. So I think right for now, our recommendation is these fleet-wide average targets, but it is supported by these technical underpinnings that show what we think is going to move fastest. I see questions on NOx. So maybe I can go to you, Sarah. Question on the FEL limit. I think maybe you can just help folks understand a bit more what that limit applies to. There's a question here about whether that applies to NOx or greenhouse gases. And maybe you could just say a little bit more about how the FEL cap works or is connected in a way to ZEBs, because I think that's just kind of would be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, so the FEL cap is basically saying that because there's this crediting, averaging and banking credit trading system, where you can gain credits for any family of engines that is below the emissions limit, then you can use those credits that you gained for engines that are above the emissions limit. But what's included in here, and what's been included also in regulations in the past, is basically saying even if you have enough credits to certify this family of engines much higher, there's some limit that you are not legally allowed to go higher than for the certification. And if you're looking at just diesel engines, what that does is it always averages out to be the family or to be the overall emissions limit. So the engines that are certified below that will average out with the engines that are certified above. But when you add ZEVs into the mix, you're basically adding extra credits that are unrelated to diesel engines themselves. So you're allowing diesel engines to certify above the emissions limit without averaging out the diesel engines that are below. So when the FEL cap is high, you can have more engines that are certified at this high NOx limit. And oh yeah, sorry, this is all for NOx, not for GHGs. And when you have a lower FEL cap, basically you're limiting the amount of ZEV crediting that you can do, because at some point you're going to hit all of your engines or some large number of your engines at that FEL cap. One danger with that, with the ZEVs, is that you end up essentially saying your new diesel engine emissions limit is essentially that FEL cap, because at some point you're going to be able to certify all of your engines at that limit instead of the actual emissions limit.
Yeah. Right. So it seems to me like the risk right now is that with such a high FEL cap, EPA is proposing in its option 1 that even though on paper the standard is set to achieve a 90% reduction in 2031, in practice, the flexibility that the FEL cap provides may turn the FEL cap into the de facto standard. Is that right?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. Thanks for that. Maybe to stay on NOx here, could you, Sarah, just clarify or just state whether the recommendation is to achieve the 90% NOx reduction by 2027, which basically would mean EPA's standard proposed for 2031 would just move to 2027. Is that as simple as it is?
Yes, it's essentially that simple. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let me move over to Claire now. So Claire, could you help audience understand whether we've estimated the baseline percent of ZEVs in model year 2027, and do we include in that baseline the states that have adopted the MOU or the ACT? Maybe you could just say a little bit more about our modeling.
Yeah, so for our baseline, we are assuming, we're estimating that percentage of ZEVs in specific segments under the ACT rule that's been adopted in 6 states now, and also California's Innovative Clean Transit rule. And that gets us to an overall percentage for heavy duty vehicles of about 3.3% in 2027, increasing to 7.7% in 2030, just for a little context. And then we have this secondary MOU scenario, which assumes a similar thing on the bus side, but for the truck side, assumes that the rest of the states that signed this multi-state MOU would also adopt the ACT, and that gets to an overall percentage of heavy-duty vehicles in 2027 of 5.8% and 13.5% in 2030. And so we kind of use both of those as like a baseline of state action, and then the possibility for more state action kind of independent of any federal action on ZEVs.
Great, thanks for that. And another question on the GHG side, this one on backsliding, and I'm going to try to read this one. Hopefully you can understand it. But the question is, for backsliding, was this bounded by engine standards, which are not subject to the multiplier? Is this just for internal combustion engines, or does this include spark ignition, which do not have proposed stringency changes?
Yeah, I think I'm understanding this question. We're considering all of the proposed changes, even though those are only 17 of the 33 segments were updated, and so we kind of map those to our segments and the percentage of vehicles in each that would change based on the proposed updates to those specific segment standards for, and those are kind of at the vehicle level for the greenhouse gas standard. I think this is not necessarily what the question is specifically asking, but for backsliding, just for a little bit of context, I showed the potential for manufacturers to increase their emissions above what was required earlier in 2021 or 2024, or even above the 2017 baseline. But that's actually not what we assumed in our modeling. In our modeling, we just assumed that manufacturers wouldn't backslide at all in those cumulative CO2 results. And so the backsliding analysis is really what could be possible if manufacturers take advantage of that ZEV supercrediting mechanism. I'm not sure if I got all the points on that question, but hopefully some helpful context there.
Great. Now we have a question that I think I'm going to try to respond to first, but I'm interested in Claire and Sarah's any compliments to that. The question is, does ICCT think it is economically feasible for OEMs to invest in R&D for electrification to meet ZEV requirements and advanced IC technology to meet engine standards? I would say the position that our program is taking on this topic, because it comes up quite a lot. I think the message is received, particularly from the OEMs, that they're being asked to invest in ZEVs, and so given limited R&D budgets, although we don't know exactly how limited those are, but let's say there's a finite amount of resources in the world to invest in technology, assuming there's a limit, and that limit means one does not have enough resources to invest in zero-emission vehicle platforms and more efficient ICE platforms. What do we think the rules should allow? And I think we're seeing, in particularly with the ZEV crediting design, that right now EPA's proposal is to, in essence, allow manufacturers to invest in ZEVs, and the incentive basically is, if you invest in ZEVs, you can pollute more, right? And that is, from our perspective, not the right arrangement, right? I think from our perspective, what would be appropriate for EPA, and it's not just EPA, we say this to governments around the world. ICCT is an international organization based on core principles for vehicle regulation. One of those is that we would pursue greenhouse gas and air quality reductions and improvements in parallel, based on the best available technology. So our view is that it's the role of government to require manufacturers to deliver the best available emissions control technology. And then it's to the manufacturers to decide, is it still worth investing in that ICE technology, or should they pivot perhaps more quickly to ZEVs? I think that's the arrangement we would like to see, because we have learned lessons, and Europe is a perfect case study of this, where governments have relaxed emission controls on vehicles. In the case of Europe, it was diesel. Europe deliberately allowed diesel engines to pollute more so that manufacturers could invest in this more efficient technology. And Europe ended up really suffering the consequences of high diesel exhaust. It continues to this day. And we ended up with Dieselgate. Our view is that it's to the manufacturers to decide where they should invest. It's the public's role to decide what benefits are necessary and how to ensure that those benefits are delivered. So I think that's our perspective on this potential for trade-off, which we really do not want to see in this rule. Claire or Sarah, do you want to add anything more to that, or did I say it succinctly enough?
I think you got it from my perspective.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, thank you. So just trying to see here if we have any more questions. Can either of you, I guess maybe either of you could answer this one. Which states have adopted the ACT? Maybe Claire, why don't you go with that?
So there's California that adopted the rule initially, and then Oregon and Washington for kind of a West Coast sweep, as well as Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey.
Great.
And then there's also, is it 16 or 17 states plus DC now that have signed on to the MOU, which is essentially the goal, the most immediate goal is 30% ZEVs by 2030, which is relatively similar to the ACT.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Ray, do you want to mention maybe anything about potential other states potentially adopting the ACT as well?
Yeah, thanks for that, Claire. So there are other states that have adopted legislation, as well as states who are just following a standard regulatory process. Colorado would be one of those that I would point out as following a kind of regulatory process. New York State, Connecticut, and others have adopted legislation. Actually, New York State has already adopted the ACT and is now moving forward with, they've already adopted legislation that will lead to regulations that we expect will deliver a 100% zero emission truck sales requirement in 2045. And so, at least from my perspective, and this is an uncertain business, but I would say right now I'm aware of maybe half a dozen more US states that have either started the process or are close to starting the process of promulgating ACT this year. And the end result is, at least in the US market, that ZEVs are being delivered by the states first, not by the federal government. And so the kind of question for EPA in the context of its proposal is its GHG standards going to be a technology following or policy following standard, or will they actually create a framework in which the country as a whole is moving at least at the pace that we think is needed to meet its climate commitments? And so the states alone cannot deliver. At least the states that are on the radar that are making commitments alone cannot deliver. So there really does need to be a federal rule that can ensure that delivery. And I want to say we're coming close to time here, so I perhaps want to have one final question, and it's on cost. You know, we actually didn't really include much discussion of cost in this presentation. So maybe one question for you, Sarah, on the cost slide that you had, because there was a question about like what is that break-even point that you showed? You know, can you just say a little bit more about, is that what we're saying? We're not saying that's what the cost is, right? So can people, maybe you can help people understand that. And then Claire, we also didn't present our analysis on total cost of ownership, upfront cost parity, and all of those indicators for which segments can move the fastest. So maybe I can start with you, Sarah, on the NOx cost question, and Claire, you can kind of wrap up with the TCO EV cost question.
Yeah, so that's that break-even point is from ICCT analysis about the marginal cost of the after treatment that would result in, you know, benefits being greater than costs, and those benefits are both of those could be, you know, seen as somewhat shared or but largely the benefits will be gained by the public, by health benefits, by things like that. So yeah, that's not what we are predicting the cost to be. That's actually higher than what we predict the cost to be. We predict that the benefits will be large. So yeah, that's how much you have to keep the cost to, I guess. Yeah.
And yeah, that slide included what our specific incremental cost benefits were, which sort of our 13-liter engine, I think in the $2,000 to $3,000 range. And so we were just trying to indicate, you know, if you add up the cumulative benefits, monetized benefits of avoided NOx and PM from these standards, then $53,000 is what that break even would be. Basically, how expensive an engine would have to be for those benefits to equal the costs. And the distance between 53,000 and 3,000 basically is showing you how much actual benefit we think the proposed a 90% reduction would deliver. And Claire, on the EV side.
Yeah, for cost on the ZEV side, our modeling work and analysis by market segment is informed by a review of different costs from a TCO perspective, from like an upfront cost parity perspective, and also like infrastructure readiness and model availability. And so we will include, I think that will be an additional slide that we include when we post the slides from this presentation. That's a little summary chart of that cost review, which informed a lot of the segment-specific pathways that we modeled, even though we show some of the results from an overall perspective.
Okay, so yeah, I think we're close to wrapping up here. I think the last thing I want to say is thank you to Claire and Sarah and the whole ICCT team. We do intend to post these slides to our website. So for folks that were asking, because there was a question on this, these will be publicly available, and anyone who's considering, you know, this analysis and how it could inform their comments, you should feel free to make reference to these slides. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Jessica.
Yes, and then I wanted to thank everybody for participating in today's presentations. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any further questions. If we didn't get to answer your question today, we might follow up with you individually. But remember to follow us on social media and subscribe to our newsletter. Our handle is @the-ICCT. Thank you again, and we hope to see you soon, and have a good rest of your day wherever you are. Bye, guys. Thank you.